Hi, and welcome to Season 2 of the Team Deakins Podcast, a collection of informal conversations between Roger and James Deakins and a guest. We never know where the conversation will take us, so listen in and see where it goes. This episode is sponsored by Aperture, a premier manufacturer of LED lighting with the industry's greatest variety of fixtures for your complete lighting needs. Aperture recently announced the new Storm family of lights. With LED white light quality that matches natural daylight and classic tungsten bulbs, plus extreme low-end dimming while maintaining color quality. Discover more about the new Storm lights and the complete Aperture lighting ecosystem at aperture.com. Today we're doing something fun. We have with us Joe Walker, editor extraordinaire. His credits are too many to list and include Sicario, Blade Runner 2049, Dune 1, and Dune 2. We'll talk first about the evolution of film cutting and then go on to doing a deep dive into the films In Cold Blood and possibly Army of Shadows. All very big topics, so let's see where it goes. Let's start with film cutting. You had something to say, Rod?
Yeah, I just want to start it off because it's really interesting in this day and age. We're doing films that are one shot, right? You know, you've got Victoria and Boiling Point and the TV series Adolescence, which is literally one shot, unlike 1917, which is a series of shots put together to make it feel like one shot. But originally, films were actually one continuous shot. They didn't have the power of editing. So the shot in the film ran as long as the camera was loaded with film, and it was hand cranked, and that's what you got. The first film with more than one shot I read was made in 1898 by Robert W. Paul, the same British pioneer who invented a camera that allowed for multiple exposures on the same piece of film emulsion, a technique used by the more widely known filmmaker George Méliès. The first reverse angle cut is attributed to James Williamson at the Brighton School in England in a film called Attack on a China Mission Station in 1900. I've got to see that. I've never seen that.
It's a great sign that the British were always at the vanguard.
Yeah, we were in there. But the American, Edward Stanton Porter, was the first person to use multiple shots. He used 20 shots in a 12-minute film called The Great Train Robbery, along with cross-cutting editing of simultaneous action, which I guess we refer to now as montage. So the whole world seemed to have turned in a circle. We started off, or filmmakers started off with restrictions of one shot. And now with modern technology, you can do one shot for a 45 or an hour-long movie that includes drones and handheld walking and all sorts of modern techniques. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? We've gone back to the Buddhist beginning.
I kind of often wonder if that's, I mean, there's also The Studio, which had a very meta episode, which was which was all about Awana. And I often wonder whether a lot of it is in reaction to the times, which is that we are overly manipulated everywhere we look, and more so than ever. And in a way, filmmakers, even though it's a double bluff, are trying to kind of give the illusion of realism again, and real time provides that frame in a way that convinces you that this thing is really happening. I mean, I would say an evidence of manipulation is my 13-year-old daughter came to LA, and I said, "Where do you want to go? Do you want to go to the beach, Ojai, to the desert?" And she said, "Target." And I was going, well, you know, I'm out of Drano and Clorox. So, but, you know, she'd seen a TikTok influencer doing this marvelous thing about how Target is the greatest palace of LA. But I think sometimes it's in response to that. It's funny how in the last couple of years, you're absolutely right, the kind of the convincing wanna has become like exalted.
As though it's more real.
Yeah, I think that's always the way. Yeah, I mean, that's the whole job of putting together a film, shooting and directing and acting and editing, is a big trick, as we all know. When you kind of
Yeah.
when you look at a piece of film and look at one frame, it's a moment captured in time, and it's as dead as a doornail, and you're really working very hard to kind of convince people that things are really happening, but in such a kind of controlled way, without giving things away, giving it away. And somehow, for me, it's all become, maybe because of the directors that I love working with, it's become a sort of job of withholding that cut as long as you can, if you can, of trying to kind of starve the audience of some information or some release. I mean, I don't want to go on too much, but I mean, like Steve McQueen in particular is notable for kind of, we had one shot with a 17.5-minute long shot in it, which was more or less the length of the real film in the camera. And it was, what happens there is really unusual. It becomes a little bit like looking at a painting in a gallery. There's a certain detachment and frustration an audience, I think, feels when the editor isn't going to reward them with a cut or take the pressure off or, hold your hand in some way. And when you kind of, once you've kind of tackled that notion, the engagement is somehow stronger.
I think, it can also create tension because you're not sure why they haven't cut away and what are you supposed to be looking for in this close-up of a face. So you have to pay attention because it's not evident. But also there's the positioning of the cut. You read something about, what was that experiment?
I think I'm talking about montage, which is the kind of reverse of what we're talking about, the one-take reality thing. The Kucherov experiment, the Russian director Lev Kucherov made an experiment in 1918 that took an old film clip, a headshot of a noted Russian actor, and intercut it with a shot of a bowl of soup, a shot of a child playing with a teddy bear, and a shot of an old woman in a casket, dead. When he showed the film to the audience, they praised the actor's performance, the hunger in his face, the delight in the child playing, and the pain at seeing the woman dead in the coffin. The shot of the actor was taken years before this film was made, and obviously the actor would have never seen the shots. And what's more, it was exactly the same shot that Kucherov used over and over again. And the audience kind of praised the actor's performance
in different ways,
because
depending
of
where
the strength of the montage. And it's really interesting, I think, that this idea of montage then went into all Soviet propaganda and was used by Eisenstein in his wonderful films like Nevsky and Potemkin.
Battleship Potemkin,
yeah, Battleship Potemkin. Very, very scenes where images are cut together that tell a story that is nothing to do with those individual images, really.
I always feel a bit sorry.
Losing that in a way.
I always feel that Kuleshov, the actor, was very largely uncredited for his broad sense of humanity.
That's right. Yeah. It's rather like Robert Mitchum, who I always thought was a very minimal actor, but it always was like amazing because you would read so much into his presence, and there was so much written on his face that he didn't. There was a history in his face, if you like.
Well, that's. I mean,
but you were
my kind of career is largely founded on that effect, the Kuleshov effect. It's
right.
I mean, the film Arrival wouldn't really mean very much if you didn't have the ability to go from Amy Adams looking thoughtful to something and us twigging that that's what she's thinking about. And, it's like a fundamental kind of tool, isn't it, in filmmaking? And it's, I mean, the ones I particularly like are where you put two things together to make a third idea. That's, that's like Godfrey Reggio, Koyaanisqatsi, you go, they have all this stuff with the commuters intercutting with sausage making machines. And it's a gag that Chaplin used. And somehow by combining thoughts, or, there's a larger kind of broader use of it where you're intercutting scenes of very different characters, which I think sometimes, the first editor I worked with, Arden, was always, I really learned a lot from him. He was a master, and he had such a kind of unconventional thinker, and he'd come from arts documentaries, really. And there we were cutting drama, and he was always very vicious with me if I suggested using a dissolve. He used to, say this mantra, if you can't solve it, dissolve it. If you can't fix it, mix it. And he was very scornful of a slow dissolve. And then he would do a wonderful dissolve. It would just be one in a film, and it would go from, some contaminated sheep on a hillside to somebody pouring water into a kettle for a cup of tea, and it was really making a sort of beauty of those transitions and making the audience think about something else, some third thing.
Well, that is the power of movies too, as opposed to a novel. Each art form has its own strengths, and the movies have the strength of cutting and being able to create, like you say, a third thing by putting two things together.
How much relied on the evolution of technology? I mean, I was jokingly about the one-shot thing. I mean, obviously, the films that are made with one shot now couldn't have been made even 10 years ago, because we just didn't have the ability to move the camera in such a way. But how much do you think the whole editing process changed with
that
with a
Fellini's editor, what you were talking about?
the splicing, invention of a splicing machine? They used to have to cut negative, right? And once they made a cut, that destroyed any idea of making a different cut.
Well, I mean, the history as I understand it, although this is always kind of like a little unreliable, is that the early Russians, Kuleshov himself would have cut the negative itself. And that meant viewing the negative through a very kind of carefully aligned projector, and the negative would drop into a sort of cloth basket that was very sort of dust-free. And then from one viewing would be able to kind of determine which take and where to cut in, where to cut out. There's also a trick.
Wow.
There's a trick that you'll know, is that when you look at negative and you turn it against the light, you can see a positive image, and that might have helped them. I don't even think they used like anything more rigorous than a take-up reel and a light box. That was the early days of cutting. And I mean, by the time Eisenstein was doing Potemkin 25, I think there was, and prints were being made, and he was cutting the print, and then a checkerboarded negative was making the final result. So they kind of solved that technology there. I mean, I've got this big, stupid theory that every 30 years there's some amazing pioneering technology that changes everything. And you could take it from sound to the 60s, where there was many inventions, actually, the lightweight camera, better stocks, sort of revolutions in the editing were to do with this joiner that was invented by Leo Catozzo, who was Fellini's editor and a bit of a very clever engineer who managed to find a way of using sticky tape or scotch tape to be able to do a join that you could unpick. He got into it because he was allergic to glue. That was actually the reason. I mean, it meant that,
So
previously it would destroy a frame or two when you made a cut.
Exactly.
And with a print, that meant that you would have to it was really laborious. If you think about it, you'd have to get a reprint, which put the negative under more stress and gave you more chances of scratching or damaging the negative. And also there was a massive cost factor to having to keep reprinting. And interestingly, I mean, when I came into the industry in the 80s, there was a remnants of the old way of thinking, which was in 35mm days, people would only print selected takes. If they shot 6 takes of a slate, then they would only print 2 of them. And you'd have to, or you get the sound, but you wouldn't get the picture. And even though we were working on 16mm, which was cheaper, at the BBC, there was still that kind of selected take. People would put P, meaning print, even though actually everything is printed. So there was a little remnant of that. But yeah, the next technology was in the 90s, which was digital, the move to digital. And I think, honestly,
wait. But so before we go there,
Yeah.
The splicer allowed them in a way to feel better about, oh, well, let's try it this way, or let's try it without having to make such a major commitment. So do you think that allowed more experimentation in the cut because it wasn't so dreadful to undo?
Well, in the 60s, there was kind of an opening for a lot of younger editors, simply because the studios would only trust the older, the old dogs who'd come in and know exactly where to cut. And there was a certain emancipation, Thelma Schoenmaker,
That's
for
interesting.
example. I mean, there were lots of people who got a break earlier because there was less risk. There was a huge risk to the budgets of these films for somebody to be indecisive. So it allowed you, and also I think it allowed people to cope with much larger volumes of material. The traditional filming method, although Chaplin might be a bit of an exception and people like that, but there were, for the most part, it was very, a conservative amount of shots done for a scene, 4 or 5 for a sequence, and then only a limited number of options. Whereas, you then hear of films like Reds, which, had sort of endless amounts of material being shot forever. I think being able to nimbly move around that material and be able to kind of try things out very experimentally without any cost was a big, significant change.
Though I was just going to mention that some people like Joel and Ethan Coen, they would do selected takes for years, and well, in the 90s, and they would shoot very, very few shots too.
But they also would shoot, if they shot a close-up, they would only, instead of going through the whole scene like everybody else does, they would shoot it for the middle 2 lines because that's when they knew they wanted to be on it. But then again, they were cutting their own films.
Yeah.
I always rather love the stories of them viewing and tinging a bell to say that they were ready and it was ready to be joined up to the next one.
yeah, and they kept cutting on a movie earlier for years, I think.
Yeah.
But then they did embrace non-linear editing very early.
They were amazing too in how well they know the material, because when we did Hail Caesar, which was on film, we had a stock problem. And so I would go and look at the dailies and I could come to them on set and say, look, the stock problem occurred again on this setup, but only on takes 1, 3, and 4, and we had 6 takes, and they would sit there and go, okay, that's fine, because we'll probably use take 5 anyway. So they would know that 1, 3, and 5, or whatever I said, they wouldn't be using, which was amazing to me. But anyway, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No. It's all. I mean, their style of filmmaking is really it's stunning, and it's sort of It just feels like it takes a lot of intelligence to be able to kind of plan and shoot a film like that, and presumably it really allows a little extra time to get things absolutely right, rather than just trying to kind of stab at everything.
Yeah, exactly.
But
yeah,
I was going to lead on to say that the next revolution, I think, is around now, which is AI. And that's a big kind of difficult conversation in the industry because, of course, I've heard many production designers saying that they refuse to endorse Midjourney, for example, even as a research tool, because it's, theft. And I've seen some very early kind of editing tools which are to do with assembling a scene automatically using AI, and they're better than you might expect. I mean, it's still, I would put it as a kind of like a talented second assistant's first assembly. It doesn't show a very deeply evolved, experienced view of the material, they'll use, a wide shot several times, sort of without purpose or meaning. And we all know that, the kind of part of the craft of this job is reading what the camera department have given you and try to work out where, when do you go into close-up is one of the biggest questions, because there's a power to close-up that you don't get in a medium shot, and an extreme power from an extreme close-up, and a wide shot has its own power as well. Is it, if you save it for later in the scene, are you exaggerating the kind of stillness of a moment or the separation of two
Right.
characters, or is it adding a breath in a way to an
Yeah.
argument? These are all things that are sort of deeply evolved human choices that we're all making, and
Yeah.
they haven't quite got that.
And they're not formulaic. That's the problem. They're not formulaic, and creating a rhythm and then breaking it in the middle of a shot because you want some sort of effect probably would not occur to AI, because they're going, okay, this is the formula, this is what we do.
What's
I
impressive,
don't
though,
know.
that this is what I'm looking at after only a year of the thing being around, and that's where when it's being trained on 50,000 films, it's going to be a different matter, and I mean, already artificial intelligence has been used in Avid for many years. I mean, there's scriptsync, which is a kind of form of artificial intelligence. So it's not as if there aren't tools around, but I mean, in audio terms, the tools are really beguiling. I mean, in terms of temp tracks, for example, in the old days, I'd get, Mary, my first, to do a voice for Amy Adams, and it would stay through numerous screenings, and right at the end, when we knew what line we wanted, we'd get Amy Adams
Yeah.
in, and she'd record all these lines in one session. But nowadays, of course, it's really easy to sample Amy Adams' voice and type whatever you want, and nobody's ever going to notice. And it might even sort of help you hone the choice of words you're going to use. I mean, I've heard of writers who use, online software to listen to the dialogue in their scripts with kind of imaginary casting. They're all tools, and the difficulty is, on a film like The Brutalist, that was savaged, and in a funny way, it was savaged because the guys fessed up to it. I've heard of. Sorry, I'm deviating a little bit, but we're at that point.
no.
No, that's fine.
We're at that point in the industry where the ethics are still being worked out, and I've never heard a better example than a friend of mine who I met the other night, who said, "We're on a film for a studio that does not allow any AI in the making of their films, and yet they've just cut the VFX budget in half. And one of the companies that is pitching for the VFX work has got the word AI in the title of their company." So, we're in sort of hot waters at the moment, trying to kind of work out the impact it's going to have on personnel and salaries and the quality of the film.
Right.
And when nonlinear editing came in, the Avid, and how did that change cutting?
That was a massive revolution, and I was sort of, that was exactly sort of 10 years into my career, and I'd been worked on film at the BBC, and then people started over there with Lightworks, which was a very sort of film editor friendly system, and it's still around.
Yeah.
And then Avid came in very sort of ubiquitous now. Avid is the main thing. I think first of all, there was a kind of generational sweep insofar as a lot of older editors didn't get on with it, and yet they couldn't maintain their positions. So there were a lot of early retirements and people who just struggled with the kind of transition. So again, a bit like the 60s, there was another kind of, it was some of the old guard, a few statues fell down, you know what I mean?
But at the same time, in the past, if you were going to say, all right, well, let's try it this way, it was a bigger deal because then you had to pull it apart, look in the bins, put the old pieces back, and then put it. So there was a certain amount of time. But now it's, oh, let's look at this. Oh, wait, let's change it around this way. And there's no thinking time in between. So how does that affect things?
Well, the contrast is really made well by, Walter Murch did a film recently called Her Name is Moviola, and it reconstitutes a film cutting room, and he takes the dailies from a film that's already been, exhibited, and he tries to pretend it's a sort of normal day at work in a cutting room in the sort of mid 80s or maybe early 80s. And a lot of that day is spent viewing and deciding. And there's a moment where he's just sitting at a bench with his, head in his hands, trying to kind of figure out what is his journey through a scene, because of the cumbersome nature of putting it together, and especially on a moviola, which I think, is a kind of vulgar clattering machine that's, where you can barely hear the sound, right? I mean, I think the big change that took place was, first of all, being able to do multiple versions of a scene. There were some times where you'd look at the dailies and you'd have a path in mind, and you'd also kind of be attracted to certain performances. And you would try to kind of navigate that. It's a kind of mental act borne out by checking the material. But sometimes there's two ways of doing it, and you're kind of curious about the other way of doing it. And of course, you could do endless versions and just park them there in the bin and, have a hunch, just do it and work out which one's the better one. The other kind of big revolution was sound, because on a flatbed that we used to use on film, the editors would cut on a thing called a pick sync, or they cut on a moviola. It was two systems, and they're just little geared mechanisms with a very small screen. And then they would do the kind of fine work and sort of layering of sound, but it was never more than 2 tracks. If it was more than 2 tracks, then you had to get into a really complicated affair of mixing, taking your 2 reels down and getting them mixed down onto one in a transfer bay, and then you kind of lost the numbering that connected you to the original material. So it was super cumbersome, really hot, really, really horrible. And honestly, I remember you would bump all the time. I think I've always had that fear instilled in me of those kind of screenings where the sound of the music just suddenly cuts out hard on a frame into voiceover, because there wasn't a way of having both the sync sound, the dialogue, and the music. So you would end up with this kind of very dislocated, I mean, a lot was left to the imagination, is the truth. And especially like in terms of working with composers, I would work with editors, always say, well, that's going to be music there. It's going to be music there. But I mean, I've never worked like that. I've always put the music in. Let's put the music in and try it out and see whether I've left long enough for it. Does it hold without this music? So in a way, our jobs transformed as well, because we suddenly became, full-on sound editors every day as well. It wasn't a question of doing the work and handing it over to somebody at the end.
I was going to ask about that, because people do think, well, the editor's the editor, and then you've got all this sound crew that does the mixes and everything. But I mean, you've always been involved, because how can you divorce the picture from the sound? I don't understand that. And in the same way, how do you divorce what is going to be shot with what is edited? I mean, they're all connected. I mean, how much involvement do you usually have with a director and a cinematographer in terms of, obviously you do a block and rehearsal on the morning of a shoot and things might change, but in a general feel of the film, do you know before you go in that the director, and when you see the material, you think a scene has been shot to work as a montage, or a scene has been shot to work as 1 or 2 single long held shots? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where does that all fit together? It's a sort of jigsaw puzzle that must have some sort of structure before you go into it.
It's kind of one of the harder things, isn't it? Is that mind reading act. I don't want to be on set because I sort of want to see only what you send me. I only want to see what you saw through a lens. And if I go on set, then I'll see things that I'm imagining are in the scene, they're not. And also, I've
Yeah.
got nothing to do there, genuinely. Is I'm sort of the only person without a function. So you do feel like fifth
And you have
wheel.
plenty to do in the cutting room,
Yeah.
so
So you have to kind of mind read, and of course that's the enormous importance for editors of the script supervisor or continuity department, and we just we rely on them to sort of say again, even just the simplest thing, saying again for focus, or we'll see it, but
yeah.
it's just reminds us that that was principally a visual thing that was wrong, and not to, for example,
Right.
ignore the sound of a take. But
Mm.
Right.
I mean, it's kind of part of the fun of the job, isn't it? Is kind of watching. I mean, I'm sad that we don't all sit together in the morning and watch dailies.
Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, I think that's a big loss.
That is a big
Yeah.
loss. Yeah.
How much do you think there's I mean, we'll talk about In Cold Blood in a moment, but I think in a film like that is so structured. When do you think in American movie making in particular, there was a pressure from the studios to have options in the cut so that a director wasn't shooting? I remember Denis saying to us on set on Sakari once, I don't want to shoot close-ups. I think it works well in that one shot. And if I shoot close-ups, somebody might ask me to use it. But there was a pressure for a long time, probably very much more now on the big movies, that the
Get
director
coverage.
shoots coverage rather than a specific shot with no way out.
Well, I mean, it goes further than that. Somebody once told me that John Ford's later films all end in a fire or a flood. And the reason for that is he wanted to burn the set down so he didn't have to go and shoot a happy ending.
Oh, yeah, right, right.
Yes.
Oh, that's great.
I remember that. I think,
That's really
Roger, are
good.
you talking about that sequence where they come back from the Bridge of America?
Yeah.
That was.
Yes.
I was so
And
impressed
that
by
high
that.
white
Yeah.
shot.
I was so impressed by that decision. It really, it shows the kind of understanding you and Denny and everybody had of what was needed for that scene in context, which of course is the most brilliant demonstration of your mastery as a filmmaker, I think, which is that you're not lost in the detail of a day, and that you're thinking about where are we coming from and where are we going to, not just for the actors' performances, but you've just come from this very thrilling scene on the bridge with enormous tension built out of these wonderful ingredients. And then you actually need to, in many ways, see the two actors kind of dwarfed by their environment, and the pressure of that is still remaining, but you don't, in some way, you don't dilute it by having close-ups,
Right.
which would have been
Estrange
great.
that. Yeah, but the wide shot doesn't. Well, it's almost giving them a private moment, but it's actually more tense because you're just observing them, as you say. I think to have cut in would have kind of weakened the kind of moment. It would let the audience off the hook in a way, and it'd have gone into acting.
But for a director, it takes a lot of confidence, because if you make that decision and don't do the coverage, you can't do it the other way. And are you tired that day and not making good decisions? You have to just go, no, it feels right, let's do it. And a lot of times directors do succumb and go, okay, let's
I've always really liked,
safe.
I always like less decisions as an editor in a kind of funny way. And it's like I really, really embrace it when I'm not given a choice and you kind of make good with what you've got. I mean, 12 Years a Slave was shot as Steve and Sean Bobbitt, his DP, would always try and shoot things in one shot if they could. That was the ethos, of trying to capture it in one if they could. And sometimes, of course, that, it's like when you're looking at the whole film, there are choices that you would have made differently, but then you sort of kind of, there's tricks, there's ways of getting out of jail sometimes, especially with the VFX world that we're in. And not that that was available to us on Steve's films, but it's, I kind of like the straitjacket of it somehow. It creates a formalism in the filmmaking, which it just doesn't feel like every other film.
And it also means that the director has this vision that he's following through. So each scene isn't done a different way, generally, the people that give you less coverage have more confidence in what they're seeing. So in a way, you have more to work with. You know what they're going for.
And you can spend time on each cut and make it's more important, each cut, because there are fewer. And yeah.
It's a difficult one to talk about, isn't it? Because it's like, I've always had the kind of right, in this kind of level of filmmaking, you always got the kind of the options, the right options. And, kind of the what ifs of a scene are kind of rarely, an important discussion. It's much more about what you have and making it sing. But there is, there's a big part of me. I mean, In Cold Blood, both these films, Army of Shadows and In Cold Blood, they sort of, In Cold Blood in particular is kind of really, it really strikes you as a kind of extremely well controlled piece of drama insofar as shot size and, the sense. There are many sequences early on where it is all contained in one shot. There's a scene early where Robert Blake comes in to make a phone call and he goes from one phone booth to another.
Yes.
And the way that it follows and everything is beautifully timed with the actors and the people passing. And then it takes you to the counter and he orders aspirin and root beer or something like that. And the only time he eats aspirin with water or liquid, which the first time I saw the film, that was the largest impression that it made on me, was this guy chews aspirin dry, But then the camera starts to track round. So in a way, though it's like we were talking earlier about Wanners being a kind of thing, continuous takes, but of course they're Wanners that contain every type of shot size within them. They contain the wides, they have a track, they have a move, they have a close-up, and there's the skill of it, isn't it, is that kind of endless variety. And in Cold Blood, because everything is quite controlled and formal, it means that when you do have, faster sequences, especially with the intercutting with the murder scene, for example, and things are more, anarchic in some way. A shot will be a rolling torch on the ground and the light going across to, Dick Hickok, this character, and it's fast and it's fluid and it's bolted together in a kind of interesting way. He kind of creates, there's a tension and relaxation of expectation in all that. There's a kind of firm hand on the tiller in terms of these longer developing shots, and there's no kind of noticeable hiatus in any of the acting, or there's no dead space. It's really tight. The performance is really, really tight. And so and then it creates a certain kind of special vibe when you're in really close and hacking around all the places. It's kind of superb control.
It also is a wonderful blend of naturalism and almost film noir. I mean, you think right at the beginning, they set up the threat of the murder, and you intercut between a house getting dark and the killer's on the move, but you don't see the actual murder. It just cuts to the morning after. And there's a strange, wonderful tracking shot, a point of view going through the house in the daylight. You haven't seen the murder, you haven't seen anything like that. And you've got this very naturalistic shot.
And we're expecting to see the murder.
Right. It all builds up with the sound and the darkness and the horse running through the trees and And
it's so strong. It so uses film to get you to feel certain things without actually doing it in front of you. It's their use of cutting, their use of shots makes you feel that way. And you had said too about the adaptation from the book, how it differed. And I think that's so important because sometimes people adapt a book and just are too literal and don't use the strength of film to do what is good.
I kind of feel like he, the The adaptation, I mean, like, first of all, Richard Brooks was a writer, and he was a very, he came from that world, so he had an affinity with that Truman Capote, New Yorker kind of world, the precision and that. But, he purportedly told Truman Capote that he couldn't do it that way in a film. He can't chop around as much as Truman Capote does. But he does definitely keep to the spirit of it. And the beat you're talking
Yes.
about is, I mean, looking at it a little bit more broadly, the fact that you build up to the murder and then don't show it, and then you leapfrog into the next morning, and a very, very unconventional sort of change of perspective and point of view, one that you haven't seen anywhere else in the film. It's almost like the house's point of view. And you see the neighbors coming in, and there's some great stuff which I should talk about on the sound there, which I think is like where all these things come together, all these thoughts come together. But it's been led up to by a series of misdirects. It's not the first misdirect of the film that you think you're going to cut to the murder and you don't. There's like endless junctions where, the daughter picks up the phone and says hello, and then you cut to Robert Blake and he's answering, and it's a different conversation. Or you do a fantastic track across to a guy with a radio offering $1,000 reward, and then you cut to somebody ringing in with some information. It's like the whole film is full of, I think, scripted transitions that are constantly trying to kind of create this sense of synchronicity of multiple things magically, that's the wrong word, but in some way a higher power in some way sort of sticking these things together. When it comes to that murder, I just wanted to point out one of the kind of things I absolutely love in the film. I'm a big Quincy Jones fan, and it's kind of an interesting score. It's really, I mean, Quincy Jones was kind of bridged classical and pop in a really interesting way at that time. He'd studied Nadia Boulanger, who's a big, I came from a music background too. And so, by the way, did the editor of this, Peter Zinner, who's, a very good pianist, for example, I'm told. But Quincy, at that point, he'd studied classical music, the same teacher in Paris that taught Bernstein, Aaron Copland, taught Quincy, encouraged him not to think solely and, sort of restrict himself in genre. And it's a very kind of, he really uses instruments in a kind of role-playing way, which is kind of, something that Hans Zimmer does now very much. It's kind of, it's kind of like instrumental casting. And at that moment, what happens is a great use of music in that when it comes to it, Perry and Dick are outside in the car and they're building up the courage to do it. And you've had numerous misdirects, you've followed shadows past windows that make you think the murder's going to take place. And when it finally does, the music has just rested down to this low C. It's the bottom note of a cello. And in fact, I looked into it a little bit. It's an attachment that you add to a double bass, and it allows the E string to go down a major third, and it makes it the lowest note a string instrument can play. So if you think of it that way, it can go no lower. Feels incredibly appropriate. But also the music is super active, melodic. There's a very kind of chirpy, slightly saccharine music that he uses for the family as they're going about their day, the Clutter family. But by this stage, it just goes down to one resonant, deep, dark note that stops. It's such a brilliant choice. It's where all of the kind of intentions, they're more than just described, they're felt. And then, of course, you cut into the day and you leave the murder. In terms of the adaptation, it also does that in the book of keeping the murder to the later. But what the book does is it goes into, it sort of the book, as I understand, is much more sort of narrative threads. This is much more flashbacks, sudden, discombobulated flashbacks, whether it's wetting the bed, or whether it's sort of little visions of the father, or the father in the middle of the murder scene is probably the most kind of haunting of.
Yeah.
But it's not quite the same as the book. It doesn't chop around quite as much. But I think nowadays probably it would, because we've had Memento and Tree of Life and Arrival and many other films where the audience is super sharp at trying to kind of put all this stuff together.
It's also it's interesting because Brooks apparently paid $400,000 for the rights before the book was published, and he was obviously passionate about it. And I believe he had friction points with Truman Capote because he made it slightly more against the death penalty. And you feel at the end, and that's what's so successful about putting the murder at the end. You've got to know the two guys. You kind of, I don't say you empathize with them so much, but you kind of understand, especially the Perry character and his background, and the father, and was the father sexually misusing him, and all these sort of different things are put in there. But then he doesn't hold back with a murder. It's still, you never actually see anybody. You don't see blood. You don't see anybody getting killed, but it's absolutely horrendous, the sequence. And
it's also because at that point you do know the people,
right?
You're with them,
Right.
So that's not just the murder victim. That is the daughter that you get to know, the father.
Right. And then Brooks introduces a character that's not in the book, unless it's Truman Capote himself, who meets the detective and goes to the execution at the end, and it's his voiceover that gives you the narration that I think, and what Brooks is trying to say about the death penalty and the whole reason he's made the film, I think. But
I think, well, I mean, I think from what I've read, the film really sticks out in its time insofar as other it really, I mean, they are empathetic. The Robert Blake character, Perry, they pick up hitchhikers. There's a rather kind of beautiful interlude there where they pick up hitchhikers, and there's this sort of rather heartwarming scene where they go around. They're all broke, and they're collecting Coca-Cola bottles and getting a couple of cents back. He stops the daughter from being raped by his conspirator. He's sort of allowed, and I have to say, I think the film is indicative of a time where the Hays Code was about to get junked. That's a really important thing in this film, is the fact that it really flies in contravention of most of the Hays Code, and especially because there isn't a big moral statement at the end. In fact, the reverse, it's saying that this is another pointless murder at the end, as the last images of Robert Blake's body hanging from the gallows, and it's sort of there's a very strong statement of that character, the kind of Jensen, I think his name is, somebody says, well, this is all to put people off, and he walks off and says, never had. So it's the pointlessness of murder is very much the point. It's a criticism of the death penalty, I think, definitely, clearly. I'm kind of really interested with the Hays Code stuff, because by then I think people were just, it's quite interesting that there were 4 Academy Awards for the film, which sort of suggests that the society was ready to embrace kind of much more loose language that they were starting to appreciate in kind of French New Wave films and foreign films. And, I went and had a look at the daily editing reports at this marvelous library in LA, the Margaret Herrick Library, which is open to the public, I've got to tell you. And I was able to look through the kind of continuity sheets, and a lot of the notes are about alternative takes, where instead of, searching for pussy, they say poontang in an alternative take. It's like, and removing the word goddamn. I mean, the Hays Code was strictly bad language was forbidden. Even the word bastard was a contravention. And any kind of hint at morality without judgment was kind of considered a bad thing, without consequence. And of course, that ending rather diffuses that consequence because it all feels very nihilistic and pointless. And, many other things like the kind of homosexual past, which is a little bit censored from the book. In the book, the character has a gay relationship, which he hates as a merchant seaman, I think. And in the film, it's much more alluded to. That was probably a step too far for the filmmakers, but it was all, there's some very salacious comments by the father about how the child cuddled him at night, and there's some posturing in the mirror, which is kind of very kind of weird kind of homoerotic kind of vibe. It's there, but it's all that is totally in contravention of the Hays Code, which was pretty much abandoned only a year or two later.
So how did they get around it, though, the Hays Code?
Well, that's, I'm kind of trying to investigate that, but it's like, I think that they were just flying in, in the face of it. I mean, Some Like It Hot was one of the big films to have kind of really hit the side of the road, because it was, the end line of the film, and Marilyn Monroe was considered too sexual. I mean, it was a constant battle, but I think that in that decade, they were starting to ease away. I don't know, I think it meant that it was an R-rated film, and of course that had a kind of financial consequence. So they did shoot alternatives. I looked at the continuity sheets, and it's very clear the intention, because they weren't printed takes, like we were talking about earlier.
Right.
The poontang version was not circled.
Yeah, it's also interesting. I wonder what the film would have been if the studio had the cast that they wanted. I mean, I believe sort of Paul Newman was mentioned at one point, and Robert Blake and Scott Wilson weren't really known at the time. Blake had done a bit of TV, but they were chosen because they looked quite like the real characters. And also, Brooks actually shot in real locations. He was trying to make a film that is as authentic as possible, which is kind of really interesting. You always hear about films, what somebody else would have cast, or a studio, the actors they wanted, and you think, well, how would that film have worked? I can't see anybody else in cold blood but those two actors.
It's very interesting what it does, isn't it? The filming in real locations is something that really struck me, because, of course, it's a very wise move in a way if you can pull it off, because it convinces everybody that it's with the kind of cooperation of the family and community. And in fact, in the opening credits, they talk about the cooperation that they had. But to actually film in the Clutter House must have been, first of all, really chilling to do. Only a short while after the event. There's the choice of Robert Blake. As I understand it, he was like a child actor. He was in Our Gang, wasn't he? And he'd been even in a Laurel and Hardy film as a child. And then they picked the actors. I mean, that was a very wise choice in Robert Blake. So I think Robert Blake had his own demons that, with his father. He didn't go to his father's funeral, for example. And that sort of means that he was kind of closely aligned psychically with this sort of damaged person that he's playing. Scott Wilson was far less known and consequently paid less. I've seen the contract. But yeah, I think they were looking at Paul Newman, you're right. And I think Steve McQueen was sort of floated as well. And in fact, in the trailer, there's a trailer where they take the faces of the real people and the faces of the actors and they merge them. It's like they're boasting of their verisimilitude. And
really? Wow.
Well, it's kind of, I think there's the influence. Maybe this is something, Roger, about the choice of film stock. It's kind of a documentary, sort of newsreel kind of choice in some ways, isn't it? But at the time, as I understand it, like Technicolor was on the advance and black and white film was on its way out.
Yeah, it was the late days. Conrad Hall said when he got nominated for an Oscar, he's absolutely right. He would have got an Oscar if the film had been made a year previously. Because a year previously, there were 2 Oscars for cinematography, one for color and one for black and white. It was either the year previous or the one before that. Anyway, but he lost out because there was only one Oscar, and I forget what got the Oscar that year. Probably that's
What do you? I mean, what do you think the choices are there? I mean, why black and white? Why would he have stuck his neck out a little bit to go black and white?
Apparently, Brooks that was it. I mean, also he had the power as a director to demand to extend. I mean, he had bought the script himself, the rights himself, so he had a lot of clout, and he couldn't see it as anything but black and white because he felt it would bring the audience into the reality more somehow, which is, I mean, it's interesting because Army of Shadows, Melville talks about wanting to do shooting color, but in a black and white way. He wanted to take down the colors so it wasn't distracting in some way. There's something maybe, because I think about still photography a lot, there's something maybe, especially in the late 60s, there weren't really any still photographers or journalists photographing in color. You saw the world on a newspaper in black and white. Most documentaries, like Fred Wiseman's wonderful documentaries, were all in black and white. So the representation of reality, maybe Brooks was thinking, well, it's got to be black and white.
It's interesting. I mean, I think Denis Villeneuve made that choice with that film Polytechnique to be black and white because the blood was too disturbing, and one can only imagine in cold blood if that footprint on the cardboard was bright red, what effect might it make? It might have made the whole thing more salacious in some way.
Right.
But also there's a choice, isn't there, about the kind of like having the anamorphic, the widescreen. It's kind of, I mean, I know that there were more choices available then, but it sort of feels like he picked a very, it's, to me in the film, like the landscapes really stick out as kind of unusual, especially the kind of framing of them and the kind of weight of the clouds above. And, it's very skilled framing indeed, isn't it? And of course, the kind of level of black, which is, even when they're shooting in real locations, it isn't really a truly documentary approach to the lighting, is it? It's very heavy key light kind of thing.
Except for right at the end when they're in the interview room, it's a flat, soft top light, which is a really interesting choice because I'm sure Connie could have gone any way with that. But no, it goes to this really soft reality. It's very interesting. But going back again to the style of the camera work, there's a wonderful blend between that kind of laid back observing and that sort of noirish kind of hard edged lighting and hard edged shots and these wonderful dissolves and very, very carefully calculated pans, like with a coach and a train, wasn't it, or something? There's incredible kind of worked out shots.
That's definitely an editor saying hello rather violently, in my opinion.
Well, it is, but if you didn't have the shots, you wouldn't be able to match them, would you? So it's a whole marriage of pre-thinking an idea and going through with it. I mean, there's a wonderful that you mentioned in your notes, actually, we're looking at a wonderful zoom into an eye that goes into a shot on a road. I mean, these things are now you could do it in AI, right? You could create that shot and make it, but back then that had somehow to be pre-thought. And it's kind of interesting knowing Conrad Hall, and I love this film. I think it's his best work, and he's, to me, my mind, the master. But I think this is his best work because of those blends, those wonderful thought out things. And I remember talking to him where he said, I don't like storyboards. I like working with the actors in the morning and figuring out how we're going to shoot a scene. But I don't know how you make a film like this that is so well composed and so well structured, and the shots all kind of blend so amazingly.
Well, I think that you talk about it in the beginning, but then every day, and I remember this when I was starting out. Every day you come in and say, "Okay, what scene are we doing? How are we getting what's coming before and what's
Right.
coming after?" And being aware of that, I don't hear that anymore on set. Where what are we coming from? What are we going to? And just that knowledge of
Yeah.
needing to work.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it's a whole different way of filmmaking. If it's all one take, then you kind of talk about how close the locations have to be so that you're not sitting in a car driving from one to another. I mean, that sort of thing, which is similar pre-thought. But it goes back to me, the idea of sort of montage, and also the idea of voiceover. That it's kind of like, I remember when the assassination of Jesse James came out, people said, boy, it's a documentary or what? It's a History Channel. It's got voiceover. But I mean,
I like voiceover.
It's just another technique.
Well,
I mean,
I think it's because oftentimes voiceover is used when they're in a problem. So they're trying to fix something.
Right.
So that's why it never works very well. But
right.
Go on.
Yeah, I mean, it's the miracle of it all is that not only are they thinking about a Greyhound bus going straight into the point where in the operating, you make sure that the parallel lines of the bus are absolutely flat on, cutting to a train in which exactly the same thing is happening. But having looked at the continuity notes, I'm pretty sure that would have been weeks apart. So, it really, really, and I think in the script, I think I would credit Peter Zinner for a lot of kind of very clever kind of joins. I think he executed them brilliantly, but I'm fairly confident to say that they're thought out. There's so many of them. They talk about, somebody who knows the knots, and you cut to somebody who's doing the knots. It's like, everything is kind of constructed in a very clever way in that regard. The maturity of the film is the fact that it doesn't kind of get in the way, that you don't feel overly manipulated. You just feel you're in strong hands,
good hands.
Exactly. It's a little bit of a miracle, the film, I think, for that. No, I'm just sort of fascinated. You talked about that soft light in the interview room. And of course, is that a kind of statement that they're now exposed in the kind of, cold light of day kind of feeling? It is very, very different. And you're in it's a really brilliant piece of writing/editing, where you're going from two characters reacting to being caught in very, very different ways. And, John Bailey described Robert Blake's character as being like a kind of spider caught in the headlights there. There's something, his reaction is very strong. But I mean, it feels to me, I don't know, how do you achieve such heavy blacks in a film like that? How's that even done? Is he using, I don't, tricks of the trade and stuff? Is it sort of like black, whatever you called it, negative fill, or how's he controlling the image?
I think Conrad did most of it on set, with the lighting. I mean, I think there's maybe a choice of the print stock and stuff, but no, I think he, from talking to him and what I understand about the way he worked, was very much doing it on set, And these things about making Robert Blake cry in the jail cell, because he'd seen a electrician walking by with a light while the effects guy was pouring rain on the window. I kind of take that with a pinch of salt, because I remember talking to him about that and think, really? Because he used to say things like that, and he said, on Fat City, he said, the exteriors are bleached out because I put the wrong film stock in. I put in 500 ASA film stock, or the loader did. Well, I don't think 500 ASA stock actually existed then, so I'm not sure that really works, Conrad. So I think there's more than a little bit of chance. He knew what he was doing. If you've ever watched his earlier work on a series called Outer Limits, his work, a TV science fiction series, his work is amazing in that. And it's funny, you can see how he blended that, what he did there, and what he did in The Professionals with Brooks's previous work, which is a Western.
We were on a film and we had a little, like several days off for Thanksgiving and decided not to go home. So what we did is we went to the video store and we bought all these Outer Limits, and they don't put the titles until the end. And our game was, can we tell if Connie shot it? And we could always tell that's Connie because he has this very special quality.
You brought up something that's worthy of note, which is something that's changed since that time, is the preponderance of films don't have titles at the front anymore.
Mhm.
I kind of looked into it.
Yeah.
I was kind of, it's really notable in Cold Blood. It just sort of, I wonder whether that's which way round it was, what came first, the chicken or the egg in this, because in a way, sort of In Cold Blood is it's a masterful, slow build to that murder. I think it takes almost like 2 reels of film to get there. And in that time, you have these amazing moments where you go from the Cutler house and you sort of pan round and you've got these Chinese elms, this sort of canopy, cathedral-like canopy. And it's very still, but it's there and designed to support titles, actor titles and writer titles and everything else. And even the music is sort of, it's stopping and starting. It knows when to kind of get chilly, to use for want of a better word. He knows how to freeze. And this sense that you've got this sweet little family, although it's not overly saccharine, one of the kids smoking in the basement and the mum's, an ex-psychiatry, nothing is, they're trying to humanize them as much as possible. But you sense that they're the vulnerable little, the vastly vulnerable little weed waiting for this monster to arrive. And it's showing a lot of open roads, which I think are really effective cinematically. And the sense that the villains are very dynamic. They're moving through the air at great speed. They're coming by car. They're coming by, Greyhound bus. They're sort of mobile all the time. You have this sense of, this all building up to that moment that we talked about earlier. But part of that equation was where do we put the titles? And nowadays, the tendency is to leave you have to contractually oblige to put production credits at the front. So you get logos and then you get this production, that production. But then you get on with the film. And in fact, nowadays, everybody's really all about engaging you in a very dynamic, arresting sequence at the beginning of a film. And such a kind of slow, careful build, suspenseful build is perhaps a little bit out of place these days. So, I mean, I looked at the 10 to try and I was wondering whether this was a hunch or bullshit. So I had a look at the top 10 films nominated this year, and 9 out of 10 of them don't have titles, don't have actor credits and director credits at the beginning. So there's only one that has it, which is Honora, and that's all just confined to one shot, which is the tracking shot across the lap dancers. So, and it's got heavy music. So in a way, it doesn't interrupt the flow of the film at all. Whereas the titles in Cold Blood, there's even one shot that goes across and there's an optical still frame in order to kind of keep the shot longer, probably, or avoid a kind of tiny operating glitch or something. But it's kind of curious to me I wonder whether also that's part, again, like I was saying earlier about the influence of social media on kind of, the wanna. I wonder whether it's also, in the world of social media, it's a completely different world, that if you don't grab people in the first 5 seconds, you've lost them. I had an experience of working with some amazing YouTube guy who's got this brilliant podcast. He's a visual podcast, and he did a little analysis of the worm ride in Dune 2. And he showed me the figures. He's got an app on his phone that shows the engagement over time. And it's just a natural thing on those things that those that want to see it will stay all the way through. But there's a floating figure of 3 times that amount that will give it 5 seconds and then say it's not for me.
Wow.
That sort of brings me back to the Kushelov experiment, right? Because apparently in the last 10 years or so, people have been people, those that know, have been looking into the idea and how music affects an audience as well, and calculating how to do these things. So the Soviet Union used the montage as in a way for propaganda, and now we are using the same techniques and studying how we can manipulate our audience. But I find it really kind of kind of shocking, really, isn't it?
It is. It is. We're in a different planet now. But actually, what's kind of curious about this thing to me is that, presumably you show all these sort of things, and that if you think about how does a Steadicam shot, what is the feeling of a Steadicam shot compared to a track? What is the difference in the mood? It's subtle enough for the viewer, to somebody, people like yourselves. It's not a mystery at all. It's like it's in your vernacular of daily conversation. But for the audience, the differences are subtle, and I often wonder, insofar as we know that one of the first hit films was a train coming towards the camera. And a one-shot wonder, documentary wonder that apparently had people, jumping out of their seats and trying to get out,
running out the cinema,
finding the exits, right? And then they got bored of that. And then you have the intercutting that you talked about earlier. And there's another famous one, which is a woman who's in a flat that's on fire, and it's intercutting with the kind of fire brigade getting there. And of course, that was the first sort of sense of dramatic tension out of cutting, a really strong sense of dramatic tension. Will they get there in time? Will they save the baby? And then audiences, again, it's the kind of the beautiful choreography of camera and editing and whatever the piano player was playing, right? And but it's like, what my question is really is like, what, how do we transmit this knowledge? Because if you showed, I saw Final Destination Bloodlines the other night, and I thoroughly enjoyed every damn minute of it. It's brilliant. But an audience from 60 years ago would have some kind of aneurysm watching it, and things will be baffling. Things won't hold together in the mind the way that they do. And, we all see that. My daughter, when she was young, was kind of so adept with an iPad, at a ridiculously young age. It sort of felt like inbuilt knowledge, it's inbuilt technical ability.
Well, it's also, wasn't Hitchcock the one that ended up starting, if someone's walking to the door, getting out of a car and walking to the door, you can see them start to get out, and then you see them at the door, being able to take out that whole part in between, when before you saw everything, because everybody thought, well, you see everything in real life, why wouldn't you see it? And so didn't he sort of bring in that kind of abbreviated cutting that's gone to all extremes now?
Yeah, but it's so strange, isn't it? You could relate that to painting, when I guess it was the French artist, I don't know if it was Degas or whoever, took a portrait and cut off the people's knees, so they might be standing there, but you wouldn't see their feet. And this was like shocking to the audience looking at the paintings and the exhibitions and stuff. Where's the guy's feet or the lady's feet? I mean, it's probably our perception. Now, if somebody made In Cold Blood today, would you'd have to make it in color. Would you do the murder? Would it have to be up front? And would it have to be one take?
Yeah, I think that would be the thing.
I mean,
I don't know quite how you do the time trend, but yeah, you would start with you'd show a glimpse of something. You'd show where you're going to go. I think you want to hit somebody with something and then come back to it. I think. I don't know. But the thing is, it's such a different experience. Social media is, we flip on to the next thing, whereas if you're going to the cinema, that's a commitment. And, I always think it's a bit like going to church, right? Your soul is fully available and, entertain me is the thought. And as you sit down and then honestly, I've seen many, many bad films all the way through the end credit because I'm damn well going to give it a chance right till the end, and
But you don't have that now because you're watching it at home.
yeah, and I think the sort of, the algorithm, it's the figures show everything of people's attention span is very, very short if they aren't already committed to watching it. The accidental viewer.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting what you pointed out there, James, about like the Hitchcock thing of, of course, in editing, we're always looking for those things where when the audience knows where it's going, to jump to it is sometimes a real thrill because it complements the intelligence of an audience. There's a really good case in point with I was working on Shame with lovely Steve McQueen, and he'd shot this scene where Brandon, the Michael Fassbender character, has gone to see his sister Sissy singing in a bar, and then they're all drinking together, him, his sister, and his boss. And his boss is coming on to the sister. And just as you play it on Michael Fassbender's face being deeply uncomfortable with this. And when you know where they're going, as he's sort of making a move on Sissy, you just cut straight to the back of a cab and the boss has got his tongue down Sissy's throat, right? And it's Michael's looking out the window looking just horrified. But there was a whole intervening scene that Steve shot, and
really?
Oh, bless them.
Wow.
Yeah, they kind of like did a whole night shoot outside the near the High Line, New York, and they had an ice skating rink, and they had the three of them coming out and hailing a cab, and I think it was really expensive to do, and it was sort of Jus Legime, very Jus Legime, but it was like I don't need the B, I need to go from A to C. Because that's, that's kind of percussive, and the audience always kind of, laughs, or you can feel that they appreciate the little spasm in your mind as you kind of connect those two things. And I mean, thank God, Steve was just, he's just brilliant. I said, look, can I just show you this one time, and then I promise I'll put it back. I'll never mention it again. I promise I won't, be in the dub saying, you should have. And he just looked at it once and said, yep, that's it. He let it go, which was kind of very, very good.
So we're going to pause here for the end of part 1 of our conversation with Joe Walker, and we'll resume it in part 2, and we'll actually get into one of Roger's favorite films, Army of Shadows.
I've talked about it a lot, so it'll be fun.
Directed by Jean-Pierre Melville. So we'll be doing that shortly.
Not his original name, not his real name, in fact. But he loved Herman Melville, so he called himself Melville.
That's a nice little fun fact to add to the end of this.
You can look up his real name on IMDb or something.
We'll have to remember this for part 2. Okay. See you in part 2.
If you'd like to sponsor the Team Deakins podcast, let us know at pod@teamdeakins.com. Thanks for listening. If you want more information and further discussion, check out the forums at www.rogerdeakins.com. Becoming a member is free, and you can ask follow-up questions there. And be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more new questions and topics. Also, check us out on Instagram at team.deakins. See you next time.